This is not a surprise to anyone who has watched the Kingdom of Valmont for the last decade. It is sad that it has come to this, but some things cannot stay buried forever. What follows is not rumor. It is the story of a single sealed file and the 4 days it took to tear a family apart in full view of the world. The palace did not whisper this time. It moved with the cold force of history. In one stunning release, a sealed genetic file connected to Prince Alaric's 2 children, Theo and Rosalind, was placed before the world, and the shockwave reached Brackenholt Cottage, where Alaric and his wife Isabel had lived since stepping back from royal duties. Before either of them could prepare a single word, Alaric read the statement once, then again, and the silence around him became heavier than any accusation. Isabel stood close enough to see the words reflected in his face before she fully absorbed them herself. The Crown Office of Valmont had released what it called an authenticated lineage verification file concerning Theo and Rosalind, and the phrase alone carried the force of a locked door being broken open. A lineage verification file meant a record tied to genetic testing, used here as the palace's strongest instrument in a matter that had moved beyond rumor and into royal documentation. Theo and Rosalind were no longer protected by distance, privacy, or the quiet life their parents had built for them. Their names had been pulled into the center of a monarchy that had waited years to speak. Isabel reached for her phone, then stopped halfway, because every instinct that had once helped her respond now felt dangerously weak. Alaric placed a printed statement on the table without a word, but his hand stayed there, pressed against the paper, as if pressure alone could push the announcement back into secrecy. The palace statement did not reveal everything. It confirmed the existence of authenticated genetic records while withholding the chain of custody, the track path showing who handled the file, when, and how it reached official control. That missing piece made the silence worse. Alaric understood why it mattered. If the file was real, the Crown Office was not merely defending tradition. It was rewriting the ground beneath his family. Isabel understood something else just as sharply. Once the royal household controlled the first sentence of the story, every answer from Brackenholt would sound like damage control. That was a trap. Not the proof alone, but the timing, the wording, the icy confidence in an institution that had chosen its moment with devastating care. King Frederick had not spoken publicly yet, but his shadow covered every line of the release. Crown Prince Nathaniel, Alaric's older brother, had not appeared before cameras, but his authority pulsed behind it. Princess Helena, Nathaniel's wife, had issued no statement of her own. She was already being drawn toward the children, toward the part of the file no one had explained. A senior aide account, quietly circulated among Crown Office staff, warned that the file held more than test results, dates, signatures, and private decisions never meant to surface. That was why the first release was only the opening blow. Hidden inside the file was a second name. Once it emerged, the storm would no longer belong only to Alaric and Isabel. It would reach Nathaniel. It would reach Frederick. It would reach Helena. But before the world could understand the file itself, it had to understand the people standing at the center of the earthquake, behind the palace walls. This was never only about paperwork, titles, or succession charts. It was about 2 children whose names had become symbols in a family conflict far bigger than they could ever understand. Theo and Rosalind were suddenly pulled into the cold machinery of monarchy, while Alaric and Isabel faced the unbearable truth that private choices had become public history. Alaric felt the anger first, hot and immediate, but fear followed faster. He was not reading the file as a prince trying to fight the palace. He was reading it as a father who knew his children would one day be old enough to understand what had been said about them. Isabel saw that fear in him, and her own shock began to harden into something colder. The palace had not just touched their reputation. It had reached the most private part of their family and placed it inside official records, the written files used by the royal household to guide names, roles, and future decisions. That mattered because once a royal record changes, it does not simply fade when headlines move on. Isabel understood the danger with painful clarity. For years, the conflict had been about interviews, image, loyalty, silence, and departure. Now the ground had shifted. Theo and Rosalind were no longer only children in a family dispute. Their place in the family line was being examined through official documentation, and that made every future mention of them heavier. Alaric's sense of himself split in two. One part still carried the bloodline, the history, the anger of a son who had walked away from the gates. The other part stood helpless beside Isabel, wondering how to shield Theo and Rosalind from a storm already carrying their names. King Frederick sat alone with the file open before him, and he did not pretend the choice was painless. He removed his glasses slowly and set them down, as if the simple act gave him one more second before duty swallowed the father inside him. The Crown's institutional authority, the power to protect its rules, records, and future structure, was now standing against Alaric's private pain. Frederick knew releasing the file could wound his son beyond repair. He also knew hiding it could weaken the Crown office in a way no monarch could ignore. Crown Prince Nathaniel received the warning with controlled silence. He was told in a private briefing that the verification file could affect how Theo and Rosalind were referenced in future royal materials. That did not mean cruelty. It meant precision. Every title, every family listing, every ceremonial mention might now be reviewed with sharper eyes. Nathaniel understood why that mattered. The next generation would inherit whatever confusion the adults failed to settle. Princess Helena's name entered the room quietly, but her importance grew with every passing line. She understood children inside monarchy differently. She knew how young lives could be shaped by public pressure before they had any power to answer it. And as Alaric and Isabel stood frozen at Brackenold, Helena's reaction became the one question no one could avoid. Yet the file did not appear from nowhere, and the road to its release began with one private incident the palace never forgot. It was not a headline, not an interview, not a public accusation. It was a private ceremony at Aldergate Hall, where a single question about Theo and Rosalind's formal place in the family line turned the room cold. From that day forward, silence became impossible. Alaric heard the pause before he understood the danger. He had joined through a private call, expecting a quiet review, a simple correction of future wording, nothing more. Isabel had been told the same thing, and that was why the hesitation in the room felt like betrayal when it finally reached her. The Aldergate naming and lineage review was meant to settle how Theo and Rosalind would be described in palace materials, a private process where names, family connections, and future references are checked before appearing in official records. It should have been routine. Instead, it became the crack that split the silence open. A senior official paused mid-sentence and placed one finger on a sealed registry note. The note carried a date that did not match an earlier private communication sent to Frederick. That one mismatch changed the air. Alaric heard papers shift, then a voice lower. Isabel later learned that officials had asked for verification instead of accepting the family's earlier assurances, and her shock hardened into fury. To her, it felt like the palace had stopped treating Theo and Rosalind as children and started treating them as evidence. Alaric tried to push back through the call, but the room no longer moved around his anger. He asked why a date mattered when the family already knew the children's place. The answer came carefully, almost painfully. In monarchy, dates matter because records become history, and history becomes authority. Frederick would one day be asked to defend whatever the palace approved, and the king could not defend a file that his own officials were now questioning. Alaric understood the meaning beneath the words. His family was no longer calling this confusion. They were calling a problem. Nathaniel received the summary later, and read it with the stillness of someone watching a private storm become institutional. The ceremony summary gave the future king more than gossip. It gave him a paper trail. Nathaniel understood then that the monarchy was dealing with evidence, not rumor, and evidence always demands an answer. Isabel felt the betrayal differently. She believed the palace had chosen suspicion over trust, procedure over motherhood, control over compassion. Alaric felt the same wound, but he also felt fear, because once the official question had been asked inside Aldergate, it could not be unasked. That ceremony became the point of no return. It gave Frederick the reason to move. It gave Nathaniel the warning to prepare. The confrontation came without cameras, without microphones, and without mercy. Alaric entered believing he could still challenge the process, still demand restraint, still force the palace to step back. But across from him sat Nathaniel, calm and immovable, carrying the one thing his brother could not dismiss: the authority of the crown, backed by proof that had already passed beyond family argument. Alaric did not sit easily. He carried the anger of a father who believed his children had been dragged into a battle they never chose. Nathaniel watched him closely, not with triumph, but with the controlled sadness of a brother who already knew the meeting would not heal anything. The private meeting had been arranged after the verification file cleared internal review. Palace officials checking the file source, handling, and approval process before allowing senior royals to act on it. That mattered because once the file passed that stage, Alaric could no longer dismiss his pressure or mistake. Nathaniel kept his hands folded as Alaric demanded to know why the palace had chosen force instead of mercy. Nathaniel did not raise his voice. That made it worse. Alaric accused him of helping the institution wound Theo and Rosalind, and for a moment Nathaniel looked away, as if the names had struck him harder than the accusation. Then he answered with the kind of restraint that cut deeper than shouting. He told Alaric that protecting the crown did not mean he enjoyed hurting him, but silence had become impossible. The crown, he explained, was not just a symbol or a word in a ceremony. It meant the legal and historic authority of the monarchy, the power that protects records, titles, succession, and public trust. That was why this moment mattered. If the palace ignored a verified file involving Theo and Rosalind, every future royal record could be questioned. If the palace released too much, 2 children would suffer for adult decisions. Nathaniel revealed that 2 versions of the public release had already been prepared. One was restrained. One was devastating. Alaric went still until that moment. He had believed the question was whether the file would come out at all. Now he understood the truth. The decision had already moved past yes or no. The only choice left was how much damage the palace would allow. Alaric pushed his chair back sharply, the sound breaking through the room like a final warning. Nathaniel remained seated and said only, "This cannot be undone now." Alaric heard the words, but what crushed him was what came after. Nathaniel naming Frederick as the final authority. The king would decide the shape of the release. The king would carry the signature. The king would choose the line between mercy and exposure. Frederick did not feel victorious. He felt cornered by the very crown he had waited a lifetime to wear. Every line of the verification file reminded him that a father's instinct and a monarch's obligation were now pulling him in opposite directions. Queen Margaret watched from across the room and did not interrupt him, understanding that the silence had become part of the decision. The advisors had already confirmed the file had passed palace authentication, the royal household checking its origin, handling, and approval before treating it as reliable. Margaret saw the pain in his face before he said a word. She knew this was not political for him, even though the consequences would be. Frederick was thinking of Alaric as a boy, Alaric as a young man in uniform, Alaric as a son who had walked away wounded. But he was also thinking of succession records and the dangerous weakness that silence could create. Frederick lifted the private note attached to the file and read it again. Delaying the release, it warned, could create a larger constitutional crisis, a serious challenge to how the monarchy's authority and public trust are protected. The phrase cut through him because it turned family pain into national risk. Alaric would see betrayal. Isabel would see attack. The public would see proof. But the king saw something heavier. If he delayed, every future statement from the palace could look like a cover-up. Margaret asked whether there was any way to protect Theo and Rosalind while confirming the proof. Frederick held on to that question like a final piece of mercy and asked the advisors the same thing before signing off. Could the children's names remain shielded from the cruelest wording? Could the palace confirm the proof without turning them into targets? The answer shaped everything that followed. Frederick picked up the authorization pen, then stopped. For one breath, the king disappeared and the father remained. Then duty returned. He signed with a slow hand, and Margaret looked away before the ink dried. She knew what the signature meant. Alaric would feel abandoned. Isabel would feel exposed. Theo and Rosalind would be protected only as far as the palace allowed. Once the king gave the order, the palace machine moved instantly, and the first consequences struck Brackenholt harder than anyone expected. The statement landed like a locked door slamming shut. No warm family call first, no private warning strong enough to soften the blow. Alaric and Isabel were suddenly watching the palace speak over them with terrifying precision. Isabel did not cry in front of the household staff. She became still, controlled, almost frighteningly calm. Alaric turned away, carrying the pain of a son who believed his father and brother had chosen the institution over his children. Isabel read the first drafted response from their communications team and saw the trap immediately. The statement tried to defend Theo and Rosalind, but one sentence accidentally confirmed more than it denied. She shook her head once and said, "No, not like this." The team deleted it. Alaric said nothing. His silence became the headline before his words ever could. The second palace clarification arrived with colder precision. One phrase that had once linked Theo and Rosalind to a future ceremonial role was quietly removed. That removal mattered because it did not attack the children directly, but it changed the shape of their future. Isabel saw it. Alaric saw it. Neither needed anyone to explain what had been taken away. Isabel finally made the move no one expected. She did not call a broadcaster. She did not call a lawyer. She asked for one private conversation. Not with Frederick, not with Nathaniel, but with Helena. Alaric looked at her, as if the name itself changed the temperature in the room. Isabel knew why it mattered. Helena understood royal children, public pressure, and the cost of being born into a story written by adults. Helena answered with caution, but not coldness. Isabel asked a question she had been holding back. Would Theo and Rosalind be punished socially for what the palace had released? Her voice stayed controlled, but it broke once on Rosalind's name. Helena paused before answering, and that pause carried more humanity than any official statement. She said the children would not carry the full burden of adult decisions. Then she added quietly, "They are children. That must still matter." Helena revealed that Nathaniel had insisted the palace statement avoid language that directly shamed the children. Isabel went silent. She had believed the prince refused to stop the release because he wanted damage. Now she understood something more complicated. Nathaniel had not blocked the proof, but it fought to narrow the cruelty, allowing accountability for the adults while trying to shield Theo and Rosalind from becoming targets. Isabel felt the ground shift beneath her anger. Alaric still felt betrayed by his father. Isabel still felt wounded by the palace. Nothing about the call erased the pain, but Helena had drawn a line the public could understand. The adults would face the consequences while the children would remain protected. By sunrise, the monarchy's private wound had become the public's obsession. Newspapers and broadcasters locked onto the same phrase, lineage proof. What began as a palace file became a national reckoning over family, truth, titles, and trust. One front page captured the entire emotional temperature of the morning in 5 words. The proof and the price. A crowd gathered outside the palace gates, not loud, not wild, but fixed in place as if history had pulled them there. One elderly woman told a reporter that the children should be spared, but the truth had to come. That sentiment gave the palace exactly what it needed. Public feeling bending toward the line Helena had drawn privately. Protect the children. Judge the adults. In the end, the loudest part of the story was not the palace statement, the public reaction, or even the file itself. It was the silence that followed. Alaric and Isabel,